I work at the Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge. And so I wanted to kind of take a different take on talking about the refuge and some of the things that we have here in western Minnesota. So you may be puzzled by the title, A Rainforest in Our Own Backyard, Preserving the Tallgrass Prairie, but hopefully that will all become clear shortly. So I'll kind of give a little introduction to myself. I'll talk a little bit about national wildlife refuges in general, as well as a background on Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the tallgrass prairie, what we do for management at the refuge. We're going to talk about bigger landscapes beyond just the refuge, as well as some of the research that we do out there. So as a little introduction, I titled it Rainforests in Our Own Backyard. So I've always been interested in rainforests. I think they're wonderful places full of lots of life and lots of different animals and plants to see. Most people think of them as just wonderful biodiverse places that are under a lot of threat from people coming in and logging them, which is very true. So this is where I've spent a lot of my professional career in Madagascar off the southeast coast of Africa. I grew up outside of Chicago. I did a lot with prairies growing up. My dad worked for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. So I kind of got my foot in the door with prairies, but my real passion for conservation was over in Madagascar. So I spent over 10 years working in Madagascar with lemurs. You may have heard of the show Zaboomafoo. It was on PBS for several years. I worked with that lemur for a while. And Madagascar is really this place that's just full of biodiversity. There's so many species there that you're not going to find anywhere else. You go anywhere and there's lots of life around you. And of course, in the last 50 years, the island has lost almost half of the forest that was there in the 1970s. So I was really curious as a college student to go off and explore that. So while I was at Duke University for my undergrad, I studied lemurs. I did a master's studying lemurs, but I kind of did some prairie stuff as well because I was near a prairie working there. And then I did my PhD at Virginia Tech, also in Madagascar, but trying to keep a door at home as well, working with some of the landscapes there. So anyway, Madagascar, here we can see there's lots of forest loss from the 50s into today, and a lot of that is due to agriculture. People are cutting down the forest, they're trying to grow their food. It's hard to blame them, they're very poor, it's what they do to survive, but here on the other side of the world, we see it and think, oh, we're losing all of that life. It's a tragedy. So we're going to change gears a little bit into what we do to try to prevent those things in the US. We've got our national park system that everybody's probably familiar with, and that's really our way of making sure that our biodiversity stays intact. We've got those big landscapes that protect lots of things like bears, moose, different endangered species, things like that. And those national parks are really focused on getting people in touch with nature, letting people get outside and recreate and just experience the natural beauty that we have here in the United States. National wildlife refuges are also doing a similar thing. So both national parks and national wildlife refuges are through the Department of Interior. So both federal organizations, but the national wildlife refuges have a little bit of a different goal. With the refuges, there's really a big emphasis on wildlife conservation and even restoration, and a bit less of an emphasis on the recreation aspect. So if you visit a wildlife refuge, you're not going to find as many trails, you're not going to find as many interpretive services, but there is a big network of folks in the National Wildlife Refuge system who are working to conserve and restore different plant and animal species across the country. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I'm not talking too fast. I can talk fast sometimes. So across, like I said, there's national wildlife refuges across the entire United States and all of our territories as well. So while there's maybe 50 or 60 national parks, there's over 560 national wildlife refuges. So you can see Big Stone is right here, and there's a whole bunch of refuges up here in North Dakota, and then a bunch along the coastways as well. So does anybody have any idea why there's maybe so many national wildlife refuges up there as well as along the coasts? I'm gonna make this interactive. Sorry? Theodore Roosevelt, yeah. So he started them, yeah.
Waterfall.
Yeah, waterfowl. So North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, Montana, that's all part of what's called the prairie potholes region. And here in the prairie potholes region, we produce 50 to 60% of all of North America's ducks. So if you go anywhere in the US and you see a duck, 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 2 chances it might have been bred right here in Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota. And the wildlife refuge system really has a big focus on protecting ducks. And so we've got all of their breeding grounds up here that are protected largely through wetland management districts and the waterfowl protection or waterfowl production areas that are associated with those wetland management districts. And then we've got lots of refuges along the coastlines because that's where the ducks like to go and spend their winters, as well as many other breeding birds across North America. So being here in Minnesota, in the North Dakota area, in the prairie potholes region, we're really at the heart of a lot of what the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Wildlife Refuge System is trying to protect. So someone mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. This is not Teddy Roosevelt, but it looks a lot like him. But this guy, he helped to establish the first national wildlife refuge down in Florida. It's called Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. And then Theodore Roosevelt said, hey, this is a great idea. Let's start the National Wildlife Refuge System. So here he was protecting pelicans and other migratory birds down in Florida. And now up here in Minnesota, the big purpose of Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge is to protect those breeding ducks and other migrating birds.
Are all pelicans that tame?
This is a baby pelican. It looks kind of sickly in the picture too. I don't know what's going on. But it looks like a young pelican, so it probably can't fly. And I helped with some pelican banding last year. And once they're kind of trapped in that position, they kind of freak out and think their best option is just to sit there. So his may be tame, I don't know. Otherwise, it's probably just kind of I'm out of luck. I might as well just sit here and do what I can to live. So the first refuge was established in 1903, and Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge was established in 1975. So it's maybe hard to see. This is just the general area of the refuge. Ortonville is up here. We've got Odessa right here. And a big reason for why Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge came to be was the creation of this Highway 75 dam. So most of this area was farmed, and then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came in and they built the dam here to try to prevent flooding in the upper Minnesota River Valley. And then after they built the dam, or in the process of building the dam, they said, hey, we'll give all this newly flooded farmland that we've just taken from people over to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I know there's many people here who have connections to this land. Maybe their families homesteaded on it. The Fish and Wildlife Service did not directly take the land. It's kind of a blot in the history of protected land area development. It was really for that flood prevention that the Army Corps of Engineers started. And then we were given the land to try to protect the waterfowl that were assumed to come in and live in these wetland areas that were created. But another big component of Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge is this area down here, which is all prairie that was never plowed. So that's kind of a big deal, and we're going to go into why that is. But again, all of this area down here is prairie land that was never plowed. So when we talk about prairie, people have different ideas of what prairie is in their minds. Here in Minnesota, we have what's called tallgrass prairie. And when you talk about prairie in the US, people often have these images or visions of bison out on these big open grassy areas, maybe the cowboys going up to round up their herds, maybe images of teepees out on the grasslands. But beyond that, I don't feel like most people really have a good sense of what a prairie is. So this is the prairie land that's in the United States. You can see it's a huge part of our nation. And this green area is what's called tallgrass prairie. So as we know, as you kind of go out a little further west, things are pretty dry. So you get what's called shortgrass prairie over here in the yellow. And as we start to get a little bit more rain, you transition over to this green tallgrass prairie area. And so that's a really unique prairie area, and we're going to go into why that is. So we talked a little bit about rainforests disappearing at the beginning of the talk. Well, now we're going to see how much of the prairie has disappeared. So it's probably a little hard to see, but all this dark purple area over here was once prairie area that's now been converted over to farm fields. And then we still have some intact prairie. That was the shortgrass prairie, mostly over here in the green and yellow. But if we just take a look at the tallgrass prairie over here, this lighter green is what was once tallgrass prairie, and the darker green is what's left. So you can see most of what's left is over here in Kansas, and we've got a few little pockets of it up in Minnesota. So the tallgrass prairie is this eastern side of the prairie. It's where it was really wet. You get all this rainfall coming in compared to other prairie areas, and you get these really tall grasses that can grow 5, 6, 7, 8 feet tall in really good years. And so when the settlers first came through this area, they said that there were times where people would go riding on horseback and you couldn't see them because the grasses were so tall. I don't know if the horses were shorter back then, the people were shorter, but we do get some really tall grass out here. So you'll notice that a lot of the tallgrass prairie was here in Iowa. And we know that Iowa is kind of the breadbasket of the United States. So here, as well as anywhere else you find grassland around the world, a lot of it has been converted to agriculture. There were no trees that people had to clear. There's really rich soils here. And so a lot of grasslands, both in the US and around the world, have been lost to this agriculture. So today we currently have about 1 to 4% of the original tallgrass prairie left. Some people say that the temperate grasslands are the most threatened and least protected ecosystems on Earth. So within this giant area, there's maybe one national preserve that protects the tallgrass prairie. There's a couple national wildlife refuges, but when you think of all the mountains out here that are protected by national parks, it's really nothing compared to what we have here in terms of protection and habitat loss. So in the tallgrass prairie, we get hundreds of species of plants, dozens of species of grasses, hundreds of species of wildflowers. We get hundreds of species of birds that either live here or migrate through here on their way up into northern Canada. And we have lots of different mammal species as well. So it's really a super diverse area. If you actually took an area the size of this table, of a prairie, you'd find more plant species in that little table area than you would in most rainforests in that same little area. Of course, if you blow it up, rainforests are more diverse in plants, but for a little section, you're going to find more plant species on a prairie than you will in a small section of rainforest, which is really cool. So of course, Minnesota we'll zoom in there specifically, did not escape the loss of the prairie. So all this yellow area, about a third of the state was once tallgrass prairie, and here in Minnesota, only about 1% of that remains. In the same area, over 95% of our wetlands have been plowed up as well. And again, a lot of this is just due to people trying to go out and make a living by farming. So you can't blame people for the loss of this, but we just did a really bad job of protecting it in the first place. So a lot of people kind of think that the prairie, the tallgrass prairie especially, but a lot of prairies in general were kind of gone before most people really even knew it existed. We've got lots of stories of people coming into the eastern part of the United States and having an idea of these big lush forests and the animals that lived there. If you look in any children's books, we highlight raccoons, deer, black bears, all those kind of really charismatic forest species. People can even name oak trees, maple trees, different kinds of trees. But when it comes to the prairie, I think there's just not a sense of what it was that we lost. Because a lot of the loss happened as settlers were coming out this way. And then there just wasn't any of it left. So I kind of want to just do an ode to the prairie and go through some of the different species that you can find out just over in the refuge right here. But a lot of them live across the tallgrass prairie area. So there's pasque flowers. This is purple prairie clover. Of course, monarch butterflies, everybody knows those. Their populations have declined by 80 to 90% in just the past few decades. So internationally, they're actually recognized as an endangered species, but the US has not yet taken that step yet. This is a little baby upland sandpiper. We've got lots of grassland birds. Of course, we have white-tailed deer that survive year-round, everybody's favorite. We also have some state-threatened species. So this is the state endangered ball cactus over on the right. There's actually 3 cactus species in Minnesota. We have 2 of them on the refuge. This is Carolina larkspur and false hairy golden aster. Maybe you've seen out on the roads around, if you go out on the gravel roads just outside of town, there's these tiger salamanders everywhere. Another species of state concern is the white lady slipper on the right. There's downy gentian here on the blue. We have hognose snakes. We have no rattlesnakes in this part of Minnesota, but hognose like to pretend like they're rattlesnakes. This is another species of state concern. This is yellow-headed blackbird. As you move further east in Illinois, they're an endangered species. There's almost no breeding colonies left of this bird. Illinois is the prairie state, and it has less than 1/10 of its prairies left. So what we have here in Minnesota is just really special. We're holding on to some things that other places have already lost. And of course, at the refuge especially, we still have some areas of some pretty open grasses. Of course, we have lost elk. There were elk that used to live out here. We have some up in northwestern Minnesota. And then kind of the icon of the prairie, especially the tallgrass prairie, bison. Fortunately, the DNR has made some strides towards bringing them back. But for the most part, we don't have the 50 to 60 million bison that we once had roaming across the landscape. Now there's probably about 20,000 in conservation herds, although there's another few 100,000 in private ranches, though many of those have been inbred with cattle. So apart from just a lot of really pretty things that I think are really cool out on the prairie matters for a lot more reasons than just really cool, pretty things. So these are some of the prairie grasses and flowers. Right here, you can kind of see what ground level would look like. So everything that we see on top is just a fraction of what's happening down below. So this person's about 6 feet tall, and you can see some of the plants get to about 6 feet tall above ground. But then their roots go down incredibly deep. Some of them will go 15 feet. Some will stretch a little further down than even what this graphic shows. But those root systems are doing a lot for us. So we talk about having really rich soils here in western Minnesota. That's because for thousands of years we've had these plants breaking up and dying back into the soil and creating that really rich soil base. When we think about the Kentucky bluegrass that's in most of our lawns, you can see it's really short and has about an inch or two of root depth. That doesn't really do a whole lot for that 20 feet or so of topsoil that we have. And it also doesn't do much of anything for water retention. So we saw the big flooding that happened this spring. When you have these deep prairie rooted grasses and you've got wetlands, a lot of that water just kind of pools in areas. These roots act like a sponge to soak up that water rather than let it just flood out and flood homes. So prairies have really important value for flood control. And they also provide lots of wildlife habitat, of course. We talked about the many birds that breed out there. And then as we think about climate change, carbon concerns, these roots do a great job of storing carbon underground, as opposed to in forests where a tree dies and then all that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. Prairie roots really keep that carbon down underground where it's not going to be up in the atmosphere, messing with temperatures on Earth. So now that we know a little bit about the prairie and where it's gone and what we have here, I wanted to talk a little bit about managing the prairie and what we do to help manage the prairie out on the refuge, what we do on the day-to-day. We're not just looking at pretty pictures of flowers and things, although that's fun. But I wanted to kind of give a shout out to the people who managed the prairie before us. Prairies are a really interesting landscape because they were, at least in our area, they were covered by glaciers until about 10,000 years ago. So obviously nothing lived under those glaciers. It was ice, sometimes a mile thick. And then there was just rock underneath that. And of course you can see some of that rock out at the refuge. So as the glaciers retreated, they melted, all this new life started to fill in where once there was just ice. And so prairies have only been around, this prairie here in Minnesota, not way far south, but the tallgrass prairie here in Minnesota has only been around for less than 10,000 years. So it's an ecosystem that has never been without people involved in it, which is kind of unique. Most ecosystems were around long before people got here, but not Minnesota's prairies. And so the Dakota tribes that were here, they actually did a lot of prairie management before anybody else arrived and even thought of what they were doing as being prairie management. And so the native peoples, they would keep prairies open by means of fire, grazing, and then obviously the one thing out of their control, climate. So kind of the original prairie managers were the Dakota, and we've just inherited what's been left behind. So fire is one thing that we do a lot of in the spring on the refuge. And we do this not only because the native people did it before us, there were also natural fires that lightning would have struck. But fire really helps to keep trees off the landscape. As we move further west into the short grass and mixed grass prairie, the climate is just so dry that trees don't really do all that well there, but there's still fire, there's still other things to keep the trees off. But here in the tallgrass prairie, we've got all this eastern forest that's trying to push into the grasslands, and fire is one of the big things that keeps the prairies open and free of trees. I'm not saying trees are bad in general, just prairies and the animals that are adapted to living on prairies don't like trees. And so if we want to help prairie animals, we have to get rid of trees. It's not a popular thing all the time, but what can you do? So grazing is another thing. There's kind of a three-legged stool to keeping prairies open and full of grass and flowers and free of trees. So we had fire, we have grazing. Of course, bison would have been the main grazers out on the prairie before we brought cows on. There would have been herds of elk as well that would have eaten a lot of young trees as they were coming up. But so while the Native Americans would light fires to try to bring in new grass and new growth for the bison herds to come in, today we mostly use cows to try to come in and mimic the course of bison, just because they're a lot easier to manage than big 2,000-pound wild animals that do what they want. So we work with local grazers to try to get cows out on the refuge and manage the prairie in that way. And then, like I said, there's the climate factor that we don't really have a whole lot of control over, but it is really what helps make prairies prairies. And as we know, the summers are blisteringly hot, the winters are incredibly cold, and that just makes for an environment that a lot of species, especially trees, don't do very well in. So as we get those really hot summers leading into really dry falls, that's when a lot of prairie fires would have occurred to eat up those trees, and then the bison herds would have moved in and trampled any trees that tried to come up after that. So it's really those three factors that really work together to keep the prairie prairie. And we just replicate those as much as we can on a smaller landscape. One thing that we do that probably didn't occur much in the past is we plant new prairie, because like I said, we don't have a lot of the original left. Now when we get sites that we can either remove some trees from, or we can get rid of non-native grasses and put in native grasses, we get lots of prairie seed from the areas that already have native remnant prairie. We'll also buy land that maybe just isn't useful for agriculture anymore. It's not very productive, and we'll turn that back into prairies as well. And we also do what's called interseeding, where we get a prairie area that doesn't have as much of a diversity as it probably did in the past. Maybe there's invasive species coming in, or there's just not those disturbance regimes of fire and grazing coming in to keep different competitors at bay. So we do some interseeding as well, where we're bringing in different prairie plant seeds so that we can maintain that high diversity of plant life. Of course, at the refuge, that's just one small piece of the prairie, and we want to maintain populations of birds and plants and flowers that range across the entire center of the United States. So at Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge, we're also the headquarters for the Big Stone Wetland Management District. So wetland management districts, I kind of mentioned them earlier. It was the Fish and Wildlife Service's approach to trying to protect wetlands in different areas, because they're just little pockets in farm fields that can maybe more easily be protected than a whole landscape. And we know wetlands are super important for ducks moving through the area and reproducing. So we have that kind of model set up for our area as well. So we've got all these different little pieces of protected areas, maybe a few hundred or 1,000 acres at the most, down in Lincoln and Lyon County, about an hour south of here, where we have these little parcels of wetlands and prairies that we're protecting, so that largely migratory birds, as they're flying up from the south, they have places to stop and refuel as they're heading up to Canada, where they nest for the summer. So that's one approach that we're taking to try to preserve that landscape of prairie while not being able to preserve a true landscape. It's little parcels of it. But Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge is also the headquarters for the Northern Tallgrass Prairie National Wildlife Refuge. So this refuge was established in the late 90s, and the idea was kind of similar to those wetland management districts and waterfowl production areas, where we know we can't preserve this whole swath of what was once prairie, but maybe if we can protect little pockets of prairie that was never plowed up, we can maintain the diversity that was there, and we can provide little stepping stones for different species to move around on the wider landscape or move up to their breeding grounds in Canada. So a lot of what we do at Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge with the Northern Tallgrass Prairie National Wildlife Refuge is contact landowners who have what we think is unplowed prairie and we ask if they're interested in either putting conservation easements on that land. So they're saying, I'm never going to develop it, but I'll keep my cows out there, or even selling the land so that we can protect it and make it a public option. We also do a bit of research out at the refuge. So every spring we do what's called the 4 square mile survey. And that's just these big duck population assessments that the Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for. And so these population estimates help with setting hunting limits for ducks across the United States and up into Canada. And so we're just going out and we're counting ducks, and there's some people with really good statistical skills that take all that data and they pop out suggestions for how many ducks states should allow people to hunt each year. This has been going on since the 1960s, and all of the duck work is just super encouraging. Of all the bird species out there, ducks are like the one thing whose numbers are going way up. And a lot of it is as a result of the efforts of protecting these little pockets of wetlands and managing hunting effectively. We're also doing what's called native prairie adaptive management. So we've got all of these prairie sites that should have these really diverse amounts of flowers and grasses. And then we get things like smooth brome, which is a grass from Europe and Asia. We get Kentucky bluegrass, this stuff that we plant in our yards. It comes into the prairie and it just forms these mats of these short little grasses with short little roots, and they just they take out all of the native plants and diversity. So we're doing these surveys in an effort to see how our timing of fire and grazing can help to push those grasses away and allow the native plants to come out and express themselves. We also have, like I said, those state endangered ball cactus out on the refuge. So we've worked with the University of Minnesota Arboretum and the conservatory, as well as some local folks to go out and plant some new cactus out on the refuge. The Arboretum actually collected seeds from the cactus in the fall, and they raised them to be these cute little like finger-sized cactus, and we just stuck them in the rock outcrops. And they survived the winter somehow. I don't know how. It was a really cold winter, but they're doing well, and hopefully we can maintain this cool population of cactus on the refuge. We're also just starting some research, again with the University of Minnesota, looking at how bees use the prairies that were never plowed versus the prairies that we're planting. I thought it was hysterical going out with a bunch of bee researchers because they kind of have their eye level like this, looking for where the bees are. Maybe they'll have their binoculars out if they're kind of a birder, which he was. And then there's the plant people that are down on their hands and knees. So the purpose of the research is to see if our native pollinators are doing well. Spoiler alert, they're not. But we're trying to see if the grasslands that we're planting are going to be suitable habitat for them. And so that just takes a whole team of people who know plants, who know bees, who know about prairie management to come together and try to figure out how we can improve the habitats for these pollinators that we know are important for agriculture and other things that humans like to do. We're also kind of interested in learning a little bit more about the hognose snakes on the refuge. There's not a lot of them left in Minnesota, so we're kind of wondering if our management actions are affecting them, as well as how they're interacting with other prairie species. They like to use the burrows of different ground squirrels, and so we want to see if what ground squirrels we have out whose burrows they can use, or if they're just finding their own little holes in the ground to overwinter. We're also we've been doing a bit of work on improving some of the big open water areas on the refuge. So just having that standing water over on East Pool, kind of by Highway 75, doesn't provide a lot of habitat for birds or fish. So right now we're working to be able to manipulate those water levels a little bit more so that in the fall we can lower it way down. And as shorebirds are coming back from northern Canada, they have these big mud flats where they can go and eat different bugs. We're also looking into improving fish passage on that section of the Minnesota River, since it's dammed both by the Refuge and up here in Ortonville. We've seen lots of sturgeon jumping out of the river trying to get up to Big Stone Lake, and vice versa, trying to get down the lake. So we're interested in trying to see if we could do something like they've done over at Marsh Lake and improve fish passage through the Refuge. So those are just a few of the things that we have going on and what we work on a daily basis. Of course, anyone's welcome to come out and visit at any time. We appreciate having visitors and people using the Refuge and getting involved with the Refuge as well. So with that, I will say thank you. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. I did not